Tonight, if the reporting around this Russian transfer is accurate, then people need to understand something very clearly. This is not just another headline about Iran. This is not just another story about uranium sanctions or some diplomatic argument between Washington, Moscow, Tehran, and Tel Aviv. This is the kind of development that changes the strategic map because when enriched uranium begins moving between major powers and regional powers under conditions of extreme military tension, you are no longer dealing with normal diplomacy. You are dealing with deterrence, coercion, intelligence failure, and the possibility that one miscalculation could drag the entire region into a much more dangerous phase. And that is the point most of the media will miss. They will talk about the number. They will repeat the phrase 50 tons. They will say enriched uranium. They will bring on people who speak in vague terms about proliferation, concern, restraint, and international norms. But most of them will not explain what this actually means in military terms. They will not explain why Washington is worried. They will not explain why Israel is looking at this differently than it looked at Iranian enrichment 10 years ago. They will not explain why Russia, if it has indeed made this move, would choose this moment to do it. And they certainly will not explain how this changes the balance of power in the Middle East. So let us be direct. The issue is not simply whether Iran has a bomb today. That is the wrong question. The real question is whether Iran now has the material base, the industrial knowledge, the protected facilities, and the strategic backing to move toward a nuclear weapons capability on a much shorter timeline if its leadership makes that political decision. That is what matters. Nuclear capability is not just a test explosion in the desert. It is not just a public announcement. It is the combination of fissile material, enrichment infrastructure, weaponization knowledge, delivery systems, hardened facilities, and political will. Once those pieces begin to line up, the entire strategic equation changes. The alleged transfer of 50 tons of enriched uranium from Russia to Iran, if confirmed, would represent more than a commercial nuclear arrangement. It would represent a strategic signal. It would mean Moscow is willing to deepen the nuclear dimension of its relationship with Tehran at a moment when the United States is already overextended, when Israel is already under pressure, when the Red Sea, the Persian Gulf, Ukraine, and the Pacific are all competing for the same limited American attention. That is not an accident. That is strategy. Now, stay with this because the dangerous part is not the headline. The dangerous part is what the headline reveals about the failure of the policy that produced this moment. For more than 2 decades, the United States and Israel built a strategy around the idea that Iran's nuclear program could be contained through sanctions, cyber operations, sabotage, assassinations, inspections, diplomatic pressure, and the threat of military force. That was the theory. The theory was that pressure would slow the program, isolate Iran, raise the cost of advancement, and eventually force Tehran to accept permanent limits. But battlefield reality and strategic reality have a way of exposing weak theories. And what we are seeing now is the result of a policy that assumed pressure could replace strategy. Iran did not disappear under sanctions. It adapted. Its engineers learned. Its centrifuge program matured. Its underground facilities became harder to strike. Its missile force expanded. Its regional partnerships deepened. And its relationship with Russia moved from transactional cooperation into something much more serious. That is the part Washington does not want to admit because admitting it means admitting that the entire containment model has failed. The first thing we need to understand is what enriched uranium actually means. Natural uranium contains only a small amount of uranium 235, the isotope that matters for sustaining a nuclear chain reaction. Most of it is uranium 238, which is not useful in the same way for a nuclear explosive device. Enrichment is the process of increasing the concentration of uranium 235. Low enriched uranium can be used for civilian reactors. Higher levels move closer to the zone where military applications become possible. Weapons grade uranium is generally understood to be enriched to around 90% uranium 235. But the important point is this: once uranium has already been enriched to intermediate levels, the hardest part of the work has already been done. That is why a large stockpile of enriched uranium is not just a number on paper, it is stored time, It is technical progress converted into material form. If a state has advanced centrifuges, experienced engineers, multiple enrichment sites, and enough enriched feedstock, then the timeline to produce weapons grade material can compress dramatically. That does not mean a weapon appears overnight. A nuclear weapon is not just uranium. It requires design, metallurgy, high explosive lenses, or other initiation systems depending on the design, reliable delivery platforms, command and control, and security procedures. But the fissile material is the central bottleneck. Remove or reduce that bottleneck, and the strategic warning time shrinks. That is what has Washington worried. Not because Iran necessarily makes a political decision tomorrow morning, but because the distance between capability and decision becomes smaller. In intelligence terms, that is a nightmare. When warning time goes from years to months, the margin for error collapses. When the margin for error collapses, policymakers begin looking for military options. And when policymakers begin looking for military options against hardened nuclear facilities in the Middle East, we are no longer talking about diplomacy. We are talking about escalation. But if you think that is the dangerous part, what comes next is even more serious because Russia does not make nuclear related decisions casually. Moscow understands nuclear weapons. Russia is not some minor state playing with symbols. It is a nuclear superpower with institutional memory, technical depth, strategic patience, and a long history of using military and political pressure together. If Russia is moving nuclear sensitive material to Iran, then Moscow is not doing it because somebody in a ministry made a clerical error. It is doing it because it sees a strategic advantage. What advantage? The first advantage is distraction. Every hour Washington spends dealing with an Iranian nuclear crisis is an hour it is not spending with full focus on Ukraine. Every senior official pulled into emergency meetings about Iran is one less official focused on Russia's Western Front. Every aircraft carrier moved or held in the Middle East is a resource not available elsewhere. Every missile defense battery sent to protect bases in the Gulf is a battery not sitting in another theater. This is how great power competition works. You do not have to defeat the United States everywhere. You stretch it, you force it to make choices, you make it pay attention to five crises at once, and then you watch the system begin to make mistakes. The second advantage is partnership. Russia and Iran have moved closer for structural reasons. Both are under heavy Western pressure. Both understand sanctions. Both understand the value of drones, missiles, air defense, and asymmetric pressure. Both see the United States as a power that uses economic warfare, proxy conflict, and alliance structures to impose its will. So when Russia strengthens Iran's strategic position, it is not simply helping a partner, it is building a long-term anti-pressure architecture, a network of states that can resist Western coercion together. The third advantage is signaling. Moscow is telling Washington that the era where the United States could decide who gets advanced capabilities and who does not is ending. That is the message. The United States used to assume it could enforce certain limits through sanctions, naval power, financial systems, and diplomatic isolation. But if Russia can help Iran move closer to a threshold capability despite all of that, then the message to the rest of the world is clear. American pressure is not absolute. American red lines are not always enforceable, and countries that Washington tries to isolate may still find powerful partners willing to move the game board. That is why this moment is bigger than Iran. Saudi Arabia is watching, Turkey is watching, Egypt is watching, South Korea is watching, Japan is watching. Every country that depends on American guarantees is watching, and every country that has looked at the nuclear question and said, we will remain non-nuclear because the United States will protect us, now has to ask a different question. What happens when American protection becomes uncertain? What happens when American red lines fail? What happens when adversaries move toward capabilities that Washington promised to prevent? This brings us to Israel, and this is where the official story begins to fall apart. For decades, Israel has lived under a policy of nuclear ambiguity. It does not officially confirm its arsenal. It does not publicly discuss numbers. But serious people do not need public confirmation to understand reality. Every major intelligence service understands that Israel possesses a nuclear capability. That capability has been the foundation of Israeli strategic confidence for generations. It gave Israel escalation dominance. It gave Israel an ultimate deterrent. It allowed Israeli planners to believe that no matter how hostile the region became, there was a final line below which Israeli security could not fall. That is the real meaning of a nuclear monopoly. It is not just about weapons sitting somewhere in storage. It is about psychology. It is about decision making. It is about the confidence a state has when it knows that no regional adversary can match its ultimate option. That confidence shapes everything. It shapes military doctrine. It shapes risk tolerance. It shapes how leaders respond to crisis. It shapes how much pressure they believe they can absorb. And it shapes how much pressure they believe they can impose. An Iranian threshold capability changes that psychology. Again, we are not saying Iran has publicly tested a weapon. That is not the point. The point is that if Iran possesses the material, the infrastructure, the engineering skill, and the political backing to move quickly if it chooses, then Israel can no longer plan as if it owns the final rung of escalation alone. That is a profound change. It means the region moves from monopoly to competition. It means escalation dominance becomes uncertain. It means every Israeli decision about strikes, sabotage, assassination, cyber operations, and direct military attack must now be weighed against a more dangerous Iranian response ladder. And this is where the intelligence picture becomes much darker. Israel has struck across the region for years under the assumption that it could manage escalation. It could strike in Syria. It could strike Iranian linked networks. It could conduct covert operations. It could pressure the United States to maintain sanctions. It could threaten military action against nuclear facilities. But if Iran's nuclear timeline compresses, then Israeli leaders face a terrible question: strike now and risk regional war, or wait and risk losing the ability to prevent a threshold capability from becoming permanent. That is not a comfortable decision. And anyone pretending it is simple does not understand military reality. Iran's nuclear facilities are not sitting in one open field waiting to be destroyed by one air raid. They are dispersed. Some are hardened, some are underground, some are protected by air defense, some are backed by redundancy. Iran has had decades to study how the United States and Israel fight. It has watched Iraq, it has watched Syria, it has watched Libya, it has watched every American air campaign, and it has built its critical infrastructure accordingly. This is why the fantasy of just bombing the program is so dangerous. Bombing a nuclear program is not the same thing as eliminating it. You can destroy buildings, you can damage centrifuge halls, you can collapse tunnels, you can kill scientists, you can delay production, but you cannot bomb knowledge out of a country. You cannot bomb away the political conclusion that nuclear capability is necessary for survival. In fact, a major strike would likely do the opposite. It would unify Iran's internal debate. It would strengthen the argument that only a weapon can deter future attack. It would turn a threshold program into a national weapons project with full political legitimacy. That is the part the war planners never want to discuss on television. They show maps, they show targets, they talk about bunker busters, they talk about aircraft ranges and refueling tracks, but they rarely talk about the day after. What happens when Iran responds against US bases in Iraq, Syria, the Gulf, or the wider region? What happens when missiles target energy infrastructure? What happens when the Strait of Hormuz becomes contested? What happens when US naval forces are operating under anti-ship missile threat in narrow waters? What happens when militias, drones, ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and cyber operations all enter the picture at once? This is not a video game. This is not a clean strike package. This is not a one night operation where pilots come home, politicians give speeches, and the problem disappears. A campaign against Iran would be a regional war. It would require suppression of air defense, protection of bases, missile defense, naval operations, logistics, refueling, intelligence, cyber preparation, and political permission from countries that may not want to be dragged into the conflict. It would create global economic consequences immediately because the energy market does not wait for Washington's talking points. That is Washington's dilemma. The United States has spent decades saying Iran will not be allowed to obtain a nuclear weapon. That statement became a red line, but red lines are only meaningful if you are willing and able to enforce them. If enforcement requires a war that could destabilize the Middle East, damage the global economy, expose U.S. forces to major retaliation, and still fail to eliminate the underlying knowledge base, then the red line becomes a trap. Washington is trapped between its own rhetoric and military reality. The first option is to strike. That satisfies the political demand to do something, but it risks a war that may not solve the problem. The second option is to accept a threshold Iran and manage it through deterrence, which may be strategically rational but politically explosive. The third option is diplomacy, some kind of renewed nuclear framework with inspections, limits, sanctions relief, and security understandings. That is probably the most rational path in theory, but Washington poisoned that well years ago when it walked away from agreements and turned diplomacy into a domestic political battlefield. So, what does Washington do? It drifts. It condemns, it sanctions, it holds emergency meetings, it sends messages through intermediaries, it reassures Israel, it warns Iran, it threatens consequences. But underneath all that language, there is no clean strategy. There is only the hope that the problem can be delayed, managed, or handed to the next administration. That is not strategy. That is bureaucratic survival. By the end, you will understand why this is not just about uranium or bases. It is about credibility, deterrence, and the failure of strategic judgment. Because once the United States says something is unacceptable and then fails to prevent it, the damage is not limited to one theater. Allies notice, adversaries notice, neutral states notice, Taiwan notices, South Korea notices, Saudi Arabia notices, Turkey notices. If Washington cannot enforce its red lines in the Middle East after decades of promises, why should any ally assume American guarantees are automatic elsewhere? That is the credibility problem. It does not mean the United States is weak in a simple sense. The United States still has enormous military power. It has global reach, nuclear forces, aircraft carriers, intelligence networks, satellites, alliances, and financial power. But power is not the same as strategic coherence. A country can have immense power and still make bad decisions. A country can have the world's strongest military and still be unable to translate that military strength into a politically achievable outcome. That is where America is today. The non-proliferation system is also under pressure. The old bargain was simple. Nuclear weapon states would keep their arsenals while promising eventual disarmament, and non-nuclear states would refrain from building weapons in exchange for civilian nuclear access and security assurances. That bargain was never perfect. Israel remained outside the system. India and Pakistan built weapons. North Korea withdrew and tested. The great powers modernized their arsenals, but the framework still had political weight. It still shaped behavior. Now that framework is weakening. If major powers begin using nuclear cooperation as an instrument of strategic competition, then the old rules lose authority. If states conclude that nuclear capability is the only reliable protection against regime change, invasion, or coercion, then the incentive to remain non-nuclear declines. This is the nightmare scenario, not one new nuclear state, but a cascade of states reconsidering their positions. In the Middle East, the cascade logic is obvious. If Iran moves closer to a weapon or a permanent threshold capability, Saudi Arabia will not sit quietly forever. Riyadh has already made clear in various ways that it will not accept permanent strategic inferiority. Turkey, with its industrial base and geopolitical ambition, will ask why it should rely entirely on NATO when the regional environment is changing. Egypt will revisit old assumptions, and once one regional power moves, others will begin preparing their own options. That is how proliferation cascades begin. Globally, the same logic applies. Japan has the technical capability. South Korea has the technical capability. Germany has the industrial base. Australia has advanced scientific capacity. These countries do not lack knowledge. They lack the political decision, and political decisions change when security environments change. That is the point. The barrier is not physics. The barrier is trust. Trust in alliances, Trust in norms, trust in guarantees, trust that the system will protect states better than nuclear weapons would. When that trust breaks, the technical barriers look much smaller. This is why the alleged Russia-Iran transfer matters so much. It is not only about Iran, it is about the signal it sends in a world already moving toward multipolar nuclear instability. During the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union built habits of crisis management over decades. Even then, they came close to catastrophe more than once, but they had channels, they had arms control, they had shared understandings of mutual destruction. A multipolar nuclear world is more complicated, more actors, more rivalries, more command systems, more chances for misreading, more chances for a local crisis to become something far larger. And in the Middle East, crisis management is especially fragile. The region is full of proxy networks, missile forces, non state actors, disputed borders, ideological narratives, religious symbolism, energy choke points, and external powers. Add nuclear threshold dynamics to that environment, and you create a system where one assassination, one missile strike, one naval incident, one intelligence failure, or one false assumption can trigger a chain reaction. This is where media narratives become dangerous. The public is often told simple stories. Iran is irrational. Israel has no choice. America must act. Russia is escalating. Sanctions will work. Strikes can solve the problem. Diplomacy is weakness. These slogans are not analysis. They are political conditioning. They prepare populations to accept bad policy decisions by hiding the cost. Serious analysis begins when you strip away the slogans and look at capability, geography, logistics, escalation pathways, and the actual interests of the actors involved. Iran's leadership is not suicidal. Israel's leadership is not irrational in the cartoon sense, but it is under pressure and capable of high risk decisions. Russia is not acting emotionally. Washington is not all powerful. NATO is not a magic shield. And military strikes are not policy. They are instruments of policy. If the policy is incoherent, the strikes only create a larger problem. The greatest danger right now is miscalculation. Israel may miscalculate how much time it has. Iran may miscalculate how far it can push threshold ambiguity. Russia may miscalculate Washington's willingness to escalate. Washington may miscalculate Israel's willingness to act independently. And the media may mislead the public into believing that a conflict involving nuclear infrastructure can be controlled like a routine military operation. That is how major wars begin, not because every leader wants total war, but because each side believes it can take one more step without triggering the next, one more sanction, one more strike, one more transfer, one more covert operation, one more deployment, one more warning. And then suddenly the system crosses a point where the decisions are no longer fully controlled by the people who started the process. The hard truth is this: the United States does not have a clean solution. Israel does not have a clean solution. Iran does not have a risk-free path. Russia may gain strategic leverage, but it also contributes to a world that becomes harder to control. Every actor is playing for advantage, but the system they are creating is more unstable than the one they are trying to exploit. So when people ask what happens next, the answer is not simple. The next phase will likely involve intense intelligence activity, diplomatic pressure, threats, military deployments, covert moves, and information warfare. Washington will try to determine the exact nature of the material, the storage locations, the enrichment pathways, the Russian role, and the Iranian decision making timeline. Israel will examine whether its military options are still credible or whether they now carry unacceptable risk. Iran will use ambiguity as leverage. Russia will deny violating anything while enjoying the strategic pressure created in Washington. And the rest of the region will quietly begin updating its own calculations. That is the world we are entering, not a world where one speech or one strike resolves the problem, a world where nuclear latency becomes a central instrument of power, a world where states do not need to test a weapon to gain deterrent value, a world where the ability to move quickly becomes almost as important as possession itself. That is a dangerous world because it blurs thresholds, it makes warning less reliable, it forces adversaries to assume worst case scenarios. And when states assume worst case scenarios, they prepare for worst case actions. The final warning is this: Military escalation around nuclear infrastructure is one of the most dangerous forms of escalation imaginable. It combines fear, secrecy, intelligence gaps, political pressure, and compressed timelines. It creates incentives for preemption. It rewards worst case thinking. It punishes hesitation, and it leaves very little room for error. If Washington continues to confuse rhetoric with strategy, if Israel believes force can permanently erase knowledge, if Iran believes ambiguity can be managed forever, and if Russia believes nuclear pressure can be used without long term consequences, then the Middle East may move into a new strategic era far more dangerous than anything we have seen in decades. This is not just about missiles. It is not just about uranium. It is not just about Iran. It is about the collapse of old assumptions. It is about the end of uncontested nuclear dominance in the region. It is about the failure of sanctions to produce political surrender. It is about the limits of military power. It is about intelligence systems that missed the strategic direction until the consequences were already on the table. And most of all, it is about policymakers who spent years making threats without building a strategy capable of supporting them. Bad policy does not become good policy because it is repeated loudly. Failed strategy does not become successful because officials call it resolve. And military escalation does not become controlled because people in Washington say they have everything under control. History is full of governments that believed they could manage a crisis right up until the crisis managed them. That is the lesson here. Once nuclear thresholds begin shifting, once regional powers begin recalculating, once great powers begin using proliferation pressure as a tool of competition, the world becomes less predictable and much more dangerous. The decisions made now will not simply determine the fate of one nuclear file. They will determine whether the next era is managed with restraint and realism or whether it is shaped by panic, propaganda, intelligence failure, and reckless escalation. And if the people making these decisions do not understand that, then the problem is no longer just Iran's nuclear program. The problem is the strategic incompetence of those who think they can play with nuclear escalation and walk away untouched.